Hello over there and welcome to lesson 6 of module 1, and this is the prerequisite module before you start your full stack class. So in this lesson we look at the requests and the responses in client server module. So in our previous lesson 5 we looked at the two protocols, and let's go to this request and response in the client server module. So we've been talking about this architecture here, and we said the client sends a request and the server sends back a response. So what are these requests and what are these responses and what do they look like? So when the client is sending the request, there are something called the HTTP methods that define what action the client wants the server to perform. For example, we have so many HTTP methods. One is the get method, we have the post method, the put method, and the delete method. So the get method, when the client sends a request with the get method, then the client wants the server to retrieve some data for it. For example, fetching some data from the database. And when the client sends the request with the post method, then the client wants to send some data to the server or to create some new data in the database. So in this architecture here, when the client is sending the request, along the request the client must also specify the HTTP method. So if the method is get, then the client wants to fetch data from the database. So the server will fetch the data from the database. And if the method is post, then the client is telling the server that it wants to save some data to the database. And if the method is put, then the client wants to update some data that is already existing in the database. And if the method is delete, then the client wants to remove some data from the database. So the server will query the database in order to remove that data which is specified by the client. So these are the four HTTP methods that we will mostly use in our full stack development. So you will find most of the time you are using one of these methods when you are sending your request to the server right from your client application, which is this case the React application that we are going to build. And once the server gets the request, the server is going to process that request, and then it is going to send the response back to the client. And when this response comes back, the response comes back with something called the status code. So this status code tells the client what has happened with that request, whether the request has been processed successfully or there has been some error on the server and the request has not been completed. So we have also many types of status codes, and each status code has a meaning. So when the server sends back the status code, the client is going to look at that status code, and when it sees an example like 200, then the client knows that the response has been processed success. And 201 means that the data has been created successfully. If the code is 400, the 400 code means that the client has sent invalid inputs or a bad request or incorrect request format. If the code is 404, then it tells the client that the resource that you are trying to request from the server does not exist or is not found on the server. If the code is 500, then that code means that it tells the client that there has been some internal server error. There has been some error on the server, either the server is down or there's some network error or there's some logic error on the server code. Alright, so you can also take more time and look at the other status code and research on their uses, as we have just looked at the few of the examples. Otherwise, that's all about the request and the responses in client server communication model. So thank you for joining this lesson and see you in the next lesson.